Why, hello there, everyone. Recently, I got the chance to play the closed beta test for Platinum Games and Square Enix's upcoming looter-slasher game, Babylon's Fall, and I'm warning you now, I'm going to get pretty critical in sharing my impressions with you guys. So, first of all, I would like to just be a bit more descriptive and mention the more objective things before I move on to critiquing the game, because I have a lot of critiques about it. Also, a disclaimer, I had access to this beta test for 2 days, however, I only played it for 1 day. All of the time I spent playing this game, I streamed on my Twitch channel, so I will include a link to the VOD, to an unlisted VOD in the comments of this video, so that way if you want to see my actual real-time impressions of the game, you can watch it yourself, or also if you just want to watch a long sequence of its gameplay. My point is that even after just playing one evening of this beta test, that is still more than enough to have a very well-informed opinion about the game, because there really wasn't that much to do in the game. I pretty much did everything there was to do, and also I didn't feel like playing any more of the game anyway, especially because SMT5 recently released, and I would much rather be playing that. So, what is Babylon's Fall? Like I said, Babylon's Fall is a looter-slasher, and that is a relatively new term, a relatively new genre, which I'm pretty sure was coined by Gearbox when they made Godfall. So, really, I say looter-slasher as if it's some well-recognized genre, but I'm pretty sure the only two games that would fall under that would be Godfall and this, Babylon's Fall. And strangely, they both have Fall in the title. If you're not in the know, Godfall didn't do too well, so I'm assuming that Babylon's Fall is sort of Square Enix's attempt at swooping in and stealing Gearbox's thunder, even though I don't think that's really going to happen. Anyways, even though Godfall would be the most obvious comparison to make, at least in terms of the game's pitch, realistically speaking, because Babylon's Fall was made by, or is being made by Platinum Games, it is much more similar to previous Platinum games, such as Bayonetta, in terms of the actual feel of the combat itself when playing the game. And that's partly why I feel so qualified in speaking about this game, because I have played a lot of third-person action games, such as Bayonetta, of course, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, Nier Automata, more recently Astral Chain, and of course, the Devil May Cry games. However, less intuitive from a bystander point of view is that this game takes some very direct inspiration from the Monster Hunter franchise. This is most apparent in the hub world, which is basically ripped straight from Monster Hunter Tri, to be even more specific. And there's also a hammer weapon you can get, and if you hold the button to charge it up, it is pretty much the same exact idea as the hammer from Monster Hunter. All of this tells me that Square Enix is trying fairly hard to turn this into their version of Monster Hunter by having a successful live service type game. Not that I think that'll happen. Jarringly, when you start playing the beta test for the first time, when it plops you into the Monster Hunter-esque port village, it gives you no tutorial, which is really strange and off-putting. Fortunately, I was able to figure out the combat relatively quickly. It's not too complicated, but I can imagine that maybe for someone who is less experienced in third-person action games, they might have been very confused. Obviously, though, I'm not going to consider this a critique of the game itself, because this was just a beta test, and surely when the game actually releases, it will get a proper tutorial. I just thought that it was worth mentioning because it seems like a huge oversight to not give a tutorial to people that are beta testing your game, especially when the beta test is only 2 days and they have a limited amount of time to get a feel for the game and develop an opinion on the game, right? You would want them to learn how to play the game as quickly as possible, so that way they could move on to actually beta testing it instead of just learning how to play the game at a fundamental level. Anyway, because of that, I might actually be overlooking some significant parts of the combat, but from what I have figured out, how it works is that there are different weapon types. There are swords, there are hammers, like I already mentioned, there are bows, there are staves, or staffs, rods, that's what they call them, rods, and shields. So I tried out every weapon at least a little bit, and you can assign any of these weapon types to any of the 4 move slots that you have. So out of the 4 move slots, 1 corresponds to the square button. If you put a weapon in this slot, you will use this weapon as your light attack. You have a slot that corresponds to the triangle button. If you put a weapon in this slot, it turns into your heavy attack. And you also have 2 slots for the L2 button and the R2 button, respectively. I'm pretty sure there are no differences between the L2 slot and the R2 slot, aside from just which button you press. So I'm pretty sure these are just duplicates. They just give you the option of which weapon you want on which side. So if you put a weapon on the L2 slot or the R2 slot, it basically turns the weapon into this spectral weapon, which floats behind you, which kind of looks like how the weapons are stored in Nier Automata. And you can hit this L2 button or R2 button at any point during your combo, or even if you're just blocking or something, and the weapon, this spectral weapon, will come out and hit your opponent. So it's very similar to the Devil Sword Dante from DMC5, for anyone familiar with that. The risk/reward trade-off is that using these spectral weapons in your L2 and R2 slots will use up your meter, right? So the other thing you would use meter for is dashing or evading. That's what I mean by dashing. I meant evading. So you have to choose if you want to save your meter for a defensive purpose by evading, or if you just want to go all in and attack with your L2 and R2 buttons to cash in more damage in your combo. So that seems to be the main risk/reward trade-off mechanic that they are going for. And the main gameplay loop that they seem to be going for is the loot system. So you do a quest. Just like Monster Hunter, you put up a quest on a quest board. You can have up to 3 other people join you. So typically you're going to be in a party of 4. You go through these areas, you beat enemies, and at the end you get a bunch of loot like armor and weapons. So now that I have made those objective statements, let's get into some of the more subjective things. Where do I even start? I'll start with the art style, because ever since this game has gotten trailers showing what it looks like, the art style and the art direction has been a very divisive point of contention surrounding this game. It's kind of the elephant in the room in this case. So keep in mind, I played the Phase 3 of the closed beta test, meaning that there was a Phase 1 and a Phase 2. So apparently, in between Phase 2 and Phase 3, the developers actually took some of the feedback into consideration and repealed some of the artistic filters that they had going on. So you can even see it in the trailers when they showed off the game. They had this weird blurry filter over everything. I think what they were trying to go for was some sort of painterly effect to make it look like a painting. Skyward Sword kind of comes to mind when I think of games that used a paint effect to cover up a level of detail bias. But in this case, it wasn't really to cover up the hardware limitation of a Wii. In this case, it seemed to be much more of just a pure artistic choice. But everyone had readability issues with it. So, like I said, the devs took that into consideration, and they removed it from everything but the background. So that's even more like Skyward Sword, right? But again, in this case, I think it's just purely artistic. So now things are definitely more readable. However, it's it's painfully apparent that everything in this game was meant to be viewed with that paint filter on top of it, because now that you can see the stuff clearly, the game does not look that great. I'm not a graphics whore by any means, but this really does look like a PS3 game, and the anti-aliasing on everything looks so weird and jagged, and it is just not appealing looking at all. But even so, I would always take low-fidelity graphics over readability issues. So even though the game is not impressive looking at all from a graphical fidelity standpoint, I am still very glad that they repealed some of that filter, so I think that was the correct decision, even though the game itself underneath it looks pretty bad. In fact, I think they should take this a step further and just remove the filter entirely. Get rid of it on the background as well. Just get rid of that completely. I could describe to you right now what it looks like, but I think I already phrased it pretty well when I was playing the game for myself on live stream, so I'm just going to leave you a clip of my raw reaction when I was playing the game. I know they're probably proud of whatever kind of filter they think this is, and so they removed it on everything but the background because they still want it to be on something. But I honestly think they should take that off the background as well, because that doesn't make it look like a painting. That makes it look like I have eye floaties galore. It's because of how it moves on a separate plane, like it's on a separate layer with transparency. That's what's not working. I think that's what's killing the illusion of it looking like a painting. So you can easily see for yourself that the graphics, and more specifically the art direction, is by far the most questionable aspect about this game. And I think that's going to deter a lot of people from buying it. Since we're still on the topic of art direction and just the game's direction in general, I'm going to talk about the music now. You might be thinking, oh, well, it's okay if the game looks bad so long as it has some banger soundtrack, right? Well, if you were to ask me my opinion on the music in this game, I would just respond by saying, what music? Because literally, no joke, the hub has no music in it at all. It is so awkward to walk around in there. Not only that, but the actual music that plays extremely quietly, even if you have it cranked up to max, in the actual missions, is so generic and Resident Sleeper. It literally sounds like pause screen music. It sounds like pause screen BGM during third-person hack-and-slash action combat. Third-person action games are supposed to have the most high-octane music ever, right? I understand that they wanted to give this game more of like a classical sort of feel instead of rock, but still, you could have definitely made classical music that sounded engaging and exciting. So literally what I had to do, I was worried that I was boring my audience while streaming this game. I was worried that I was putting people to sleep by playing this game. So what I did is I muted the music in the game, although I probably didn't even have to do that because it's barely noticeable and barely audible. But I muted the music in the game, and I literally just opened up a Fire Emblem battle theme playlist, and that automatically made the game feel so much more exciting just because of the music. So, game developers, please don't sleep on your music because it really does do a lot. But even despite all this, a game with bad graphics and bad music and bad overall presentation can still be redeemed with good gameplay, right? So the big question is, has Platinum Games made a combat system good enough to carry this game?
No.
Here's the thing. I love Platinum Games, right? I love Bayonetta. I love their other games. They're fun, right? However, I've noticed that whenever I play through a Platinum game, and I always say this when I'm playing a game, right? Like, the most recent one was Astral Chain. I love Astral Chain, but even Astral Chain suffered from this. Whenever I start getting near the end of a Platinum game, once you get good enough at the combat in a Platinum game, once you sort of download the combat, it just becomes this wash, rinse, repeat system, and I don't really have to think anymore, and it sort of becomes stale by the end of the game. And so every time I've beaten a Platinum game, I have never felt compelled to immediately replay it, because I felt like I've had enough. That's fine, though, because I think that all Platinum games are actually pretty well paced, and they don't really wear out their welcome at all. So it's not an issue that I don't immediately feel compelled to replay a Platinum game, because not all games are meant to be live service games, right? This, however, Babylon's Fall, is meant to be a live service game, which means they need to make the combat extra engaging and it's just lacking the depth needed in order to incentivize people to play it for hundreds of hours on end. If we were talking Devil May Cry combat, now that would be a different story, because the reason why I love DMC combat so much more than Platinum Games combat is because DMC combat is so much more intellectually engaging. It's constantly encouraging you and challenging you and sometimes even baiting you into just trying out flashier combos just for the sake of feeling cool, right? So if this were some kind of multiplayer DMC game, I'd be all over that, and I would expect that it would immediately have a bigger following than this. I think another important aspect about action games that's being overlooked in the Babylon's Fall development is the importance of enemy variety, right? One of the ways developers can keep action games exciting is to not only make different enemy types that fundamentally force you to change the way in which you approach the combat, but also once you make a good variety of different enemy types, you can then essentially make a limitless amount of content that stays engaging and stays intellectually stimulating by just making different combinations of these enemies, make different enemy compositions, right? That's why something like the Bloody Palace from Devil May Cry is so fun and why it works and why it never gets boring. I understand that what I played was a beta test, so obviously I didn't get the chance to fight all of the enemies that are going to be in the full game, right? Obviously. But even so, I would assume that the enemies they put in the beta test were meant to be a somewhat accurate reflection of the enemy variety you can expect to fight in the actual full game. So, assuming that to be the case, the enemy variety was not good at all. What's weird is that there actually were different kinds of enemies, right? But it really did not force you to change the way in which you approach the combat at all. So there were some enemies that used melee, there were some enemies that shot you, right? There were some goblin guys, there were some armored guys, but really it did not matter what the enemies were, because once you got in close and you started comboing them, it literally made no difference. So every single room with enemies, every single mob, you approach the same exact way. So when you're going from room to room, it literally feels like you're just turning your brain off because you're doing the same exact thing in every encounter. And that gets old really quickly. Just to be fair, though, keep in mind that in the footage you're watching, one of the other beta testers enlightened me in how OP the hammer is in this beta, because if you use the attack button in the air with the hammer, you do this launcher of sorts, and then if you press the button again, you will do this downward attack, which results in an AoE when you hit the ground. And you can cancel out of anything with dash, provided you have the meter for it, right? So you can literally just basically instant overhead your launcher with the hammer. So you want to jump and then immediately press the launcher button so that way you can launch a grounded opponent. And then you immediately hit the button again to slam them down, and then you can hit multiple enemies with the AoE, and then you cancel that recovery with a dash, and then wash, rinse, repeat. So the footage you're watching, you're probably seeing me do that a lot, so I'm not going to hold that as a critique against the game, obviously, right? Because that's just a matter of balancing. So I know that the game is going to be more balanced when the game actually comes out. So just because the weapons are unbalanced during the beta test, I'm not going to hold that as a critique at all. But I know that even without the hammer being OP, it would not make the combat more interesting, because I would still just find a method to consistently damage the enemies, and I would just keep doing that over and over, the same thing. So I know that it still would not be any more interesting. Speaking of weapon balance, the shield is definitely the weapon I used the least, just because it felt completely pointless to use a weapon that's reliant upon counterattacking, because it's so easy to run up and just start stun locking enemies. There was really no reason to use the shield over something else. So the weapon loadout, just for reference, the weapon loadout that I used for the majority of my time spent playing this beta, I had a sword on square as my light attack. I had the hammer on triangle as my heavy attack, and I had two bows on L2 and R2. I had a bow on L2 and a bow on R2. So when I was doing the hammer loop, the hammer stun lock loop, I was able to just mash L2 and R2 to deal more damage. But even after all of this, even with boring gameplay, just because the game doesn't appeal to me doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't an audience that likes a game in which you can turn your brain off and just grind for loot, right? Well, if Square Enix wanted to target that audience, then they should have made the loot way more meaningful and way cooler looking. Because none of the armor or weapons in this game really, at least in the beta test, of course, none of the weapons or armor I got really fundamentally did anything, right? Like, they had higher stats, of course, so I equipped the best things, but none of them actually affected the gameplay in any meaningful way. So not only that, but none of the armor looked very good either, right? In equipping things that just had the best stats, I was always wearing this unappealing hodgepodge with a horrible color palette, and I had parts of my armor clipping into each other. So if I were in charge of making this game, if I knew that I was in charge of making a looter slasher live service type game, I would target the Fashion Souls lore walking demographic so hard. I would make it my utmost priority to make every armor set look so cool and put so many different ones in the game. So that way, even if the game is boring, right, even if the game doesn't sell too well, it would still have its own dedicated audience of players who like showing off their different armor sets in front of each other, right? Not that complicated. The loot system is literally the entire gameplay loop here in Babylon's Fall, so I don't know why they did not put more effort into this part of the game, considering this is supposed to be the main thing that keeps incentivizing players to come back and play the game. What do I think will happen when this game finally launches? I think it's going to have a very mixed reception and very middling sales. However, it is Square Enix and they have a lot of money, so I think that Square Enix is going to keep on pumping money into this game, giving it updates, fixing the graphics, things like that. So I think that eventually they're going to update the game to a point where it reaches some kind of equilibrium, to the point at which it has some kind of dedicated player base. I don't think it'll ever become a big thing. I don't think it'll ever become the big thing that they want it to be, right? Like, it's no Monster Hunter for sure. But I think that it's probably going to carve out some kind of niche on Twitch, just because it is incredibly easy to keep up with your Twitch chat while playing this game, because as I've said, you can pretty much turn your brain off in the combat, and so that frees up the rest of your brain space, and it frees up the rest of your focus to focus on your Twitch chat. And I think that's why Destiny sort of carved out its own niche as well. So I don't think Babylon's Fall is going to be as big of a flop as Avengers. I think it'll be somewhere between Avengers and Destiny. Either way, I have no plans on picking up this game when it releases. I also think, though, that after this game undersells, I think it'll be a very long time before we see any other video game company take on the, quote, looter slasher genre. Because like I said, the only two games that have done the whole looter slasher thing, it was Godfall and now this, Babylon's Fall. So if 2 out of 2 end up flopping, especially because Godfall was by Gearbox, which is a pretty big AAA developer, and now this by Square Enix. Square Enix is another really big AAA developer. If 2 really big AAA developers try their hand at making this kind of genre and fail at it, then that is probably going to deter a lot of other companies from trying their hand at it, which is really unfortunate because I think that the looter slasher genre actually has a lot of potential. And now we are not going to see that potential realized until a very long time once all of this fades from recent public memory. Man, remember that Ultraman-looking game that got teased by Platinum Games last year? I think it was called Project GG or something like that. Man, that looks so cool, and I'm so excited for that, and it really annoys me knowing that Project GG is coming out much later rather than sooner just because Platinum Games has been busy working on Babylon's Fall for Square Enix. Anyway, if you have played the beta test yourself, please let me know what you thought about it in the comments, or if you haven't gotten the chance to play it yourself, well, first of all, you're not missing out on much, but if you have only seen gameplay of this game and haven't played it yourself, let me know if you plan on picking up the game when it launches. So, with all that said, I will see you all later. Bye for now.